Tom, do you know the correct plural word for fish?
I don't. Oh, I know it's not fishes. Well, I don't think it's fishes.
Okay, well, so here's my fun fact of the day. If you have several of the same kind of fish, the correct plural is fish. So if you've got lots of salmon, you'd say you have one salmon is one fish, 7 salmon is 7 fish. Okay?
Yeah.
If you've got several, if like in your pond, you've got several different kinds of fish, then you have fishes.
Oh, so it is fishes.
In some instances, fishes is correct, yes.
Really? There we go.
Why do I feel like it should be fish?
I know. Or fish or something. One fish, several fish.
Well, there we go. Learn something new every day. Thank you, Emily.
You're welcome.
I didn't ask for it, but I'm glad I now have it. On the subject of learning, should we crack on with this episode?
Yeah, let's learn more things.
Less about fish, more about carbon.
Every day's a school day.
Hello and welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show, the podcast for the carbon removal experts, the carbon removal curious, and everyone in between.
Hello, hello. Welcome back to all those who've listened before and to any newbies to the Carbon Removal Show. Welcome.
Yeah, I guess we might have a few new listeners joining us as we kick off season 4, so it's probably best to reintroduce ourselves.
Of course, I'm Emily Swaddle.
And I am Tom Praviti.
And producer Ben Weaver Hinks is with us, as always, silently lurking off mic. Together, we've been working on a bunch of very exciting content to share with you this season. Brand new, insightful, intriguing, industry-sourced CDR chitter-chatter coming straight to your ear holes very soon.
Indeed. But before we get to that, as this is our first episode of season 4 and our first episode of 2025, we thought we'd take the opportunity to check the pulse of the CDR industry.
Yes, as we continue to climb this mountain of understanding, we're taking a moment to admire the view of the CDR landscape that surrounds us. And my, what a view!
The view has most certainly changed since we started this ascent back in 2020.
Feels like eons ago.
Do you feel like you've changed, Emily?
Whew, big question, Tom. I'd like to think I know myself more these days. I certainly know carbon removal more. How about you, TP?
I think my life looks vastly different, it's safe to say, than it did 4 years ago. CDR has taken over, for sure. First, through working at a carbon removal marketplace and now coalition member Supercritical, and now with my own biochar business, Restored.
With accompanying podcast.
Find out how it goes by subscribing to Grounded, a climate startup journey, wherever you get your podcasts. Yes, can't forget that. This show has changed my life, really. So thank you, Emily.
Tom, you're so welcome. I wonder how many other lives this show has changed. Do write in if you feel like the Carbon Removal Show has changed your life in any way, positively or otherwise.
Ben, what about you?
My beard is a lot greyer.
Don't worry, hon, it suits you.
Thanks.
Silver Fox.
And I think, like, collectively as a show, I feel like we've changed a lot over the years. You know, we started off with very little knowledge of CDR. We were doing the research, learning as we went, taking our listeners along with us on that journey.
And we're still doing the same now, but we certainly have more knowledge on our side, and enough to ask the pertinent questions at least.
Yeah, in a way, I feel like we're still semi-outsiders. Like, we have 1 foot in the CDR world and 1 foot out of it. I mean, Tom, I know you work all your days CDRing and biocharing, but collectively as a team, we're not permanently in the world of CDR.
Emily, speak for yourself. Although we may not all be in the weeds of CDR every single day, we know that some of our listeners really are.
Thank you for your service.
And we hope that it might be useful for you and for us to zoom out a little bit and take stock, particularly as we've been away for a while. Consider this a previously on and a coming up this season all rolled into one sort of episode.
Previously on the Carbon Removal Show. Why is it on TV shows when they have the previously on? It always sounds really sultry. Previously on the Carbon Removal Show. Next time on the Carbon Removal Show. That one's more dramatic because it's like leading up to it. Next time on the Carbon Removal Show. The drama continues. Dun dun dun. For those of you who aren't in CDR every day, or even at all, let this serve as some insight into where CDR is right now, where it's come from, and where it may be heading. Perhaps we can re-energize, re-inspire anyone within the industry who needs it, and tickle the taste buds of anyone thinking of stepping in.
Let's get tickling. Basically, we know that we're somewhere between the earliest efforts to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and that 2050 goal of CDR being this multi-trillion-dollar industry removing gigatons every year. But where are we on that journey? How inevitable is future progress? And what do we need to stay on track?
Okay, so let's look at where we're at. What can we see from our viewpoint up here, Tom?
Well, it's a rich and complex landscape, Emily. We've got to start somewhere. So I was thinking back to our 2023 in review episode when we looked at CDR scaling. I gathered some of the stats on durable CDR as we did back then. So let's see where we've landed a year later.
Love it. Hit me with the numbers.
So we've got a lot of data from the whole year at our fingertips, thanks to CDR.FYI. A reminder here that when we're talking about durable CDR in these statistics, we're thinking about things like direct air capture, BECCS, biochar, enhanced weathering, and so on. We're not referring to short-term carbon removal like afforestation. So here we go. Durable CDR purchases in 2024 were just shy of 8 million tonnes. That's a 78% increase on 2023 numbers. However, while the number of buyers of durable CDR increased to 216 from 202 the year before, this rate of increase has slowed. Something else to note here is that 64% of purchases in 2024 were made up by one buyer, Microsoft. That is a big percentage of the overall purchases, but it's actually down from 70% in 2023. Essentially, there's heavy concentration at the top of this list, and 3/4 of all purchases have been coming from just 3 big buyers, Microsoft, Google, and Frontier.
Yeah, that's a small handful of big hitters throwing a lot of money at this industry. So what about deliveries? Obviously, when a ton of CDR is purchased, that does not mean that the carbon is taken out of the atmosphere immediately. So although purchases have increased, where are we with actual removals?
Yeah, it's a good point, and fortunately, we are seeing growth there too. In 2024, 318,000 tonnes of CDR were delivered. That's a 120% increase on the year previous. And the majority of these deliveries are in fact biochar, with an 86% coverage.
Shout out to biochar. That's a nice big increase.
Yes, that's the kind of growth that we like to see, particularly given it is estimated by CDR-FYI that we need a cumulative annual growth rate of between 45 and 48% if we're going to reach that 5 to 10 gigaton number by 2050.
Yeah, it's amazing to see. Did you know, Tom, that when we started working on this show in December 2020, only 19,000 tonnes of durable CDR had been sold, ever. And now, at the time of recording, in February 2025, it's over 13 million tonnes. Boom.
That is crazy. I did not realise that it was so small back then.
And so big now.
I mean, yeah, I know that we were growing, but yeah, I'd not quite appreciated how big that increase has been. And it's amazing to see that. It's tough to see it day to day when you've got 1 foot in, let alone 2.
Yeah, it can be really difficult to see that kind of growth when you head down doing the work. But it's so cool to look back and see how much has happened in just a few short years. It can often feel like progress is slow. So I think we really need to acknowledge just what has been achieved already.
Yes, we are heading in the right direction, wherever that is.
Up the mountain. I will say, it's important to add some caveats at this point. Not to piss on anyone's strawberries, but I think it's important to add some caveats at this point.
Caveat away.
As we've said, we need this growth to continue at this pace for the next 25 years. We've got to keep going. It's also worth noting that some durable methods are much more advanced than others. As you said, Tom, in terms of delivered removal, it's currently biochar versus the rest of the pack. And speaking of deliveries, in durable CDR, deliveries continue to lag well behind sales. It's not surprising because that's kind of the model of the market right now, but it's a reason not to get complacent. Another thing you've mentioned is that purchases are really driven by that small number of businesses. And then also, beyond durable CDR, the overall voluntary carbon market has seen contractions. I'm just wondering, might this spell bad news for some nature-based projects?
Emily, it's funny because back in that 2023 in review episode, I feel like we were saying much of the same back then. These caveats still feel just as applicable then as they do now.
Yeah, I think we very well might have said the exact same thing a year ago, which is striking given how much growth we just saw in the numbers. But these same question marks remain. I think we need to look beyond the numbers to get a clearer picture.
Definitely. Those 2024 numbers have been floating around a bit and are pretty familiar to those of us keeping an eye on this sort of thing. The bigger question, I guess, is what's driving those numbers?
Exactly. I wanted to mention some signals from the industry that are less quantifiable. So let's start with the positives. Undoubtedly, the industry is seeing more startups with evolving missions. So we've moved beyond people proving that they can do CDR to actually exploring different ways of doing it. And people are doing all kinds of interesting things all around the world. As part of that, we also have a bigger community within the CDR industry. CDR Jobs, which is the website for industry-specific employment, is booming with opportunities to bring new talent into CDR. I just checked the other day, it's got like over 600 vacancies right now.
Wow.
We're also seeing increased funding. So data from the last year is quite limited, but we know that 2023 saw investment in CDR companies well in excess of $1 billion. That's from Statista. And then also early policy signals are very promising. 2024 saw vital progress on the Paris Agreement's Article 6.4, and we're now in the middle of a flurry of policy developments at all levels.
A flurry. That's exciting.
A flurry, like a snow flurry.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, positive signs of progress.
Now, I hate to be a negative Nelly, Emily, but we also should look at the other side of the coin.
I don't like it, but I suppose you're right.
So here we go. Some slightly less promising signals are that, for one, policy implementation is slow, and this could leave carbon removal companies with uncertain futures in the absence of such robust policies. Over the last year, we've also seen just how quickly governments and their priorities can shift. And for some countries who've been key to the development of CDR, climate itself may no longer be a priority, for the next 4 years at least. Something else to bear in mind is, a handful of years ago, every person and their dog were announcing ambitious net zero targets without necessarily realising the real-world challenge that came with reaching them. We're starting to see corporates roll back on some of these perhaps overly ambitious net zero claims. And finally, public skepticism or lack of understanding is still a very real challenge for the CDR industry.
Yeah, I see these, and they could be very legitimate barriers for the industry. Definitely some things to keep us on our toes as we push ahead.
Indeed. It would be naive of us to think that the growth of the industry would be completely smooth sailing. And we can't let impressive numbers at this stage lead to resting on our laurels.
No laurel resting for us. So, with all this in mind, how optimistic are we feeling that CDR will continue to grow at the pace we need it to?
I'm pretty confident. I'm going to back the CDR horse.
Tom, your optimism does not surprise me. Very on brand for you.
Look, I mean, obviously we have got these challenges ahead and we're still very early in the CDR story, but from where I'm standing, things are looking pretty bright. Disagree?
Settle in for story time, Tom, because honestly, I go back and forth on this. Like, when we first started researching for the show back in 2020, I got all starry-eyed and optimistic about these like incredible technologies and innovations that were going to help fill that gap between our hard-to-abate emissions and net zero. Fantastic, wonderful, oh my gosh, falling in love. Then, as we learned more, what really struck me was the scale of what's ahead of us, Like, it's incredibly daunting to think about the rate at which we have to build up this industry. And then last season, when we did our analogies episode, And we looked at all the other industries that have like achieved something similar in their own way. And that gave me a sense of, well, I don't know, maybe this might be possible. So honestly, it's been like quite a journey of emotional highs and lows. But, you know, whether we've been at like conferences and events, talking to people, watching webinars, listening to other podcasts, it does really feel like the whole CDR industry is really grappling with the realities of this vast scale that we're trying to achieve and beginning to imagine that world where carbon removal is doing its part to get us to net zero. But that's the thing. It's the industry having these conversations, Tom. And the question I keep coming back to is, does the rest of the world believe that the CDR revolution is coming? Or does it even know that we need a CDR revolution? I mean, I just honestly wonder a lot, like, are we just in a bubble?
Are you trying to extend that bathtub analogy?
Well, I have been known for taking my analogies too far. I wasn't in this instance, but now I feel like I might. Welcome to my bubble bath, Tom. Bring your own wine. Try not to get your microphone wet. This is quite a notable moment for where our relationship has come since we started this podcast.
Long may it continue to evolve. But yeah, it does sound like you've been on quite the journey, you know, highs and lows and maybe more questions than answers. And that last point is super fair. This industry is built on the promise of growth and everyone sort of has to believe in it. And we've all got a vested interest in it happening. And I guess when we all get together in the same room, it's very easy to feed off all of that optimism.
Yeah, which is great. And I totally get it. Without growth, or at least the promise of growth, which companies in this space have an actual viable business? Which investors are likely to be attracted to invest? And who would want to dedicate their careers to something that they didn't believe had a future?
Not me. I'm not getting on that horse.
Well, exactly. So I don't think this is necessarily about complacency. Everybody knows that there is a steep hill to climb. But obviously many people in this space believe it's a big part of our future, or they'd be doing something else. At the very least, perhaps there's a bit of self-selecting going on here.
Yeah, a lot of that rings true. And perhaps we're also just working a bit to compensate for some of that negativity that can be around and attaches itself to carbon removal and the carbon markets more generally, whether that's in the media or elsewhere.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes negativity that is fair and sometimes less so.
Okay, so let's throw off our optimism hats for a bit.
Okay, I'm quite stressed about this because I really like my optimism hat, but I will take it off just for you, Tom. Consider me hatless.
Just don't drop it in the bubble bath.
It'll lose all its shape.
We've got all of those negative signals that we discussed a moment ago, but what are our fears? What's keeping us up at night?
I mean, actually not much because A, I'm exhausted from my emotional journey, and B, I've relaxed in a bubble bath, so I'm ready for bed.
Got you.
But no, seriously, I want to come back to something we touched on earlier. Of those, like, undoubtedly impressive purchase figures that we all like to cite, there's like a minuscule proportion that have actually been delivered. At the time of recording, it's just 4.5%. That's all. We've always been pretty neutral on this because I guess we recognise that much of this industry is funded by those pre-purchases. But actually, what are the risks that some of these purchases are just never delivered? And if they aren't, what is that going to do to confidence in the industry? It's sad to say, but it does seem inevitable that some of these businesses will fail, possibly before they have fulfilled their orders.
Right. And as somebody who is now sold such credits, that's also kept me up at night. This actually reminds me of a conversation that Ben and I had with Robert Höglund of Milky Wire when we were at the International Conference on Negative CO2 Emissions, which was hosted by our friends at CORE in Oxford last summer.
FOMO. I wasn't there, but actually I was at a different CDR event that day in Brussels. Oh my gosh, we're so like cosmopolitan or jet setting. No, that's not good for our footprint, is it?
Don't say that.
It's tough to be us.
But yes, I'm sorry that you weren't there, you were missed. The event happened actually shortly after the closure of Running Tide, the company that were doing really cool things with algae sinking that we profiled in season 2 of the Carbon Removal Show.
Yeah, that was sad to hear. It was really cool talking to Marty about the seaweed and everything that he was doing with that.
Well, Robert had his own take on how we should think about such business closures.
There's literally more suppliers than buyers, essentially. So that is an issue. And of course, a lot of companies are going to go bankrupt. That happens even in a growing industry where there is a demand because you have consolidation and you have startups just naturally fail. So I think that's on everyone's mind, like how are we going to weather this? For me, the 2020s is really about like, let's make sure all the good ideas gets properly tested. For me, that's kind of the role of the 2020s, to set up the ecosystem that can then scale the best.
Obviously, high profile kind of failure recently, business failure in the space. I feel like there's going to be a lot of attention on failures in this space.
Yeah.
How would you suggest the industry navigates that?
Probably preempt it all and like just talk about, although then you can create a self-reinforcing cycle of less buyers, etc. But I think that everyone's really clear. That's why I also say this, because like we should expect 9 out of 10 companies that exist now not to be around in the future. That's just natural, any business. Yeah. So if everyone is prepared, then maybe it's not so much of a surprise, although journalists probably won't care, and he's right about it anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, hardly anyone has failed.
Yeah, exactly.
Failed yet. Yeah. So I imagine that, I don't know what that will do for the public perception of carbon removal if all these companies suddenly just start dropping.
Yeah. Companies that have been selling credits, right?
Yeah.
Rather than kind of quietly doing it early on.
Exactly, and also raised a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Robert makes a very good point that in an emergent industry like this, you're just going to have a lot of failure. And actually, that's going to be really valuable in demonstrating what kinds of methods, approaches, and businesses are viable and those that are just not.
Yeah, I think we've talked in the past about how pre-purchased credits at this stage in the industry are as much about contributions to the development of these businesses and the technologies that they are producing as they are about their immediate carbon removal benefit. That's a mindset that we've heard a few times from buyers of these more expensive solutions, and it's one reason that many people see these as having more potential impact over the longer term than some of the other credits out there today.
True. Still, the public perceptions aspect of all this is also crucial. And it is something that I worry about as the industry matures. And we're inevitably going to see more bad news stories, along with the good. What about you, Tom? What keeps you up at night? What keeps you up at night?
The thought of a bubble bath. Thought of a carbon bubble bath.
That's so rude that what keeps you up at night is the thought of having a bubble bath with Emily.
It's not. I think, as mentioned previously, the industry has so far just been entirely built on the VCM. But we know that unless something huge changes, the VCM is unlikely to be able to drive this exponential growth indefinitely. It's very difficult to imagine we'll get from a few million tons to billions of tons voluntarily alone. We're actually potentially seeing this in the growth of new purchases slowing and the reliance on that handful of businesses for the majority of tons bought. Overall, I think I worry that we just simply aren't going to be able to drive the cash that we need into this industry to help it scale without a major shift in that buyer behavior. And I think that probably involves a big increase in the voluntary commitments and also the integration of CDR into the compliance world policy.
And we are already seeing the first green shoots of the latter. More on that later in the series. But it is undeniable that we need something pretty seismic to happen to shift this from a small niche market to a global force.
And interestingly, Robert also had some thoughts on this during our conversation.
To what degree do you have faith in the VCM as it currently is to drive the funding that's needed into this space over the next decade or so? I mean, you take Microsoft out, there's not a huge amount left.
No. There's still an important role when it comes to learning and trying things out, because if you buy something for a few $100,000 like we do with Milky Wire, that's still hugely impactful. If it's a small team and they have never built anything before, then they can use that, they can learn a lot, they can go out to the world and tell people how that worked. So their early buyers can really have an outsized influence, even if the money is small. But I don't think we'll reach very large amounts of carbon removal, say in the hundreds of millions of tons, by any voluntary measures. So that would be more kind of, it needs to be compliance. Either companies are forced to, do it by governments, or the government buys it outright themselves.
That's interesting, because you've got that obviously kind of bar chart on CDR.FYI, and I kind of always think like, how far realistically is this going to get us across the chart?
Yes. So yeah, the VCM in terms of pure scale, I think is limited, but it has a really important part of the learning and trialing, because the compliance markets are not gonna scale up something that's not been de-risked.
Yeah.
So like the EU CRCF, this carbon removal certification framework, they're only looking at things that are relatively mature. They're not going to do an ocean alkalinity enhancement methodology in the EU. So you actually, it's thanks to DAX and BEX and biochar, actually there are methodologies, there are people doing this already. Then they can go and, okay, now we'll integrate it in the EU framework. So that's why it's quite important also to test it out in the beginning.
I think we've known for a while now that the VCM has its role to play, and it's certainly delivering that innovation that Robert talks about. But as our minds turn to the decades ahead, we're going to need other solutions.
We are indeed. And I, for one, am excited to start digging into all that this season, even if the uncertainty is giving you nightmares for now, Tom.
But returning to a more optimistic mood, I think what is pretty assured is that continued technological progress of many of these CDR methods is possible.
Yeah, agreed. That's a big learning of the past few years for me.
Yes, some of the big challenges do remain. Some processes need to become more energy efficient, others need improvements in MRV. But we've seen immense progress across pretty much all methods of CDR in the past couple of years, since we started this podcast alone. And with adequate support and investment, I think that we can be pretty confident that we'll continue to see more.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's one area where the public understanding of these technologies really needs to catch up with the reality. You know, we often see articles or discussions framing them as these speculative future advancements, you know, like far off. But we're actually well beyond this. Like nearly all major CDR methods have nudged up their technological readiness level in recent years. And we've seen deliveries across biochar, bio-oil, BECCS, enhanced rock weathering, and more.
It's such a good point, actually, because pretty much every mainstream news outlet still does talk about carbon removal as this mythical, ethereal thing, when in reality, it's happening. Plus, we don't actually need all of the current suite of CDR technologies to be delivering major removals by mid-century. Some may just be outstripped by others, or prove less practical or more costly to scale. The industry's been spreading its risk, and I think that we'll really see some methods rapidly advancing over the coming years.
Yeah, totally. And that's the thing to bear in mind, right? When we're talking about like getting to between 5 and 10 gigatons by 2050, that doesn't mean that every single technology has to remove 5 to 10 gigatons. It means collectively, as like a suite of solutions, it needs to be removing 5 to 10 gigatons. I think what we're landing on is this idea that there's a difference between what's technically possible and what's practically achievable. As we sit here behind our microphones, 4 years into this show in 2025, I think we can say that we've seen a lot of good news on the former. Carbon is being removed from the atmosphere through a range of different means. It's happening. We're doing it. Pat yourself on the back. The next step is going to be building all that infrastructure and support to ensure that it keeps happening and it happens at scale.
Exactly.
You know, actually, Tom, this reminds me of the electric car.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
I'm sensing a story. Tell me more.
Let me paint you a picture. Just humour me for a minute. Did you know that the electric car was invented way back in the 19th century?
You know what? I actually didn't know that. I thought it was a lot newer than that.
Well, in 1897, the best-selling car in the US was actually an electric vehicle. It was up against a combustion engine that we know and love, and also steam engine vehicles that people were driving on the road. Can you actually imagine? Crazy. And you can imagine like some of the pros and cons of all these different options, right? Like as we know of electric vehicles, in the early days, the issues were the same. Big batteries, not a very big range. So like cumbersome in that way, right? But at the time, your combustion engine, you had to like crank the combustion engine to get it started. It wasn't just turn the key, it was like a crank situation.
Yes, I remember those old school videos. cranking the front of
Cranking it.
the engine with that little like hole. I remember, yeah.
And general like upkeep and maintenance of combustion engine, you needed like a bit of muscle behind it, right? And so because electric cars couldn't go very far, and they were often used like just within a city or a town, and they didn't require the muscle that the combustion engine required, they were seen as kind of like girly cars, and they were often purchased by women who were, you know, just going local distances in these electric cars. And it's a fascinating story about how, you know, over 100 years ago, we had these options in front of us of different kinds of vehicle. And it just so happened that the internal combustion engine went into mass production. Henry Ford started his rollout of mass producing combustion engines. There was a lot of innovation in that field, and it made the combustion engine much more efficient. There was discovery of cheap oil, and that led to the dominance of these gasoline-powered cars. But there was, you know, at the time, maybe a sort of butterfly effect moment where it could have been electric vehicles that took the prize.
Yeah, there's some learnings in that.
I think it's very interesting. I took a lot away from this story, not least of which everyday sexism
Yes.
and maybe an unsurprising masculine shift away from something that was considered girly. But it also shows, I think, that, you know, technological progress is really bound to like the realities of markets. It's not just about we have the technology to do this thing, and so therefore it's going to win out. And if things had gone differently back then, who knows where we would be now in terms of gasoline use and electric vehicle innovation, and how much EVs would have progressed over like the century since they were popular back then. But instead, the focus went into petrol and diesel engines, and the rest is history.
There's an interesting moral in there which sticks out to me, which is, you know, just because we can do it doesn't mean that we will do it. And it's, you know, disappointing to hear that the electric vehicle was created that long ago. I had no idea. But like you say, it's interesting that market demands, market forces threw us down a different trajectory.
And, you know, it's interesting, right? Because it's not to say that if electric vehicles had taken off at that point and the internal combustion engine had kind of been left behind, that we would be like a gazillion times better off now because of that. Because who knows how like development of batteries would have leaned on like minerals and other natural resources and things. And we just don't know how it would have gone. But we do know at that particular moment in history, what succeeded didn't rely on what we have the technology to do. Because quite clearly we had the technology to do a lot of things. And it was just that one thing won out. So we can't predict the future is what I'm trying to say. And it's a fool's errand giving it a go. So, if CDR's continued growth is possible but not inevitable, how do we make sure it happens and happens well? And by well, I mean ethically, sustainably, and all that good stuff.
Well, I think that over the last 4 years, we've learned a lot about some of the big bottlenecks and blockers. Things like policy, finance, and public support. The things that enable that technological advancement, essentially. And I think that we should spend some time digging into some of these this season. Don't you?
Yeah, I certainly do, Tom. And I'd also like to add that for all of these, communicating CDR is absolutely key. Whether that's making the case for it, challenging the misconceptions and confusions, or just simply establishing consistent terminology so that CDR can be communicated clearly.
I'm sensing that we're getting back into the language chat show. Emily's language chat show.
Emily's language chat. Yeah. Emily's language chat.
Okay, here we go. It's been so long. Honestly, I think this is important because even some of our language has changed, you know? In season 1, we spoke a lot about permanence, but later we learned that durability is actually a better way of describing that spectrum of durability that CDR can have. You know, how long is the carbon stored for? How durable is the storage? This is not just an esoteric point because CDR is still not widely understood or known about. There's lots of studies on this, and we'll put a couple in the show notes so you can dive in if you want to. But even in climate and sustainability circles, we still come across people confusing CDR and CCS and the relationship between them. That's just one example.
It's really true. I think most CDR businesses spend a big chunk of their time explaining what they do. And I guess that's part of what we're trying to do with the Carbon Removal Show.
I like to think so, because I think there's a common thread here. Beyond the technologies themselves, pretty much every major lever for advancing CDR involves getting people on board, whether that's investors, buyers, policymakers, new industry talent, or just wider publics.
We've got to expand the bubble.
Exactly. That's something that our coalition member, Sebastian Manhart, reflected on when we chatted with him a few weeks ago. Like us, a big part of Sebastian's time is taken up with communicating CDR, and he's actually recently launched his own podcast and LinkedIn Live series with fellow coalition member Ava Tammer called the CDR Policy Scoop, also produced by the one and only Ben Weaver-Hinks. CDR Policy Scoop is a deep dive into, you guessed it, CDR policy.
In the early days, it was really a very small bubble. And we're seeing that bubble increasing more and more, which is good. We're seeing a lot of people coming into the field. We're seeing, if you have 500 people working in an industry, the next size of the onion is maybe 10,000. If you have 20,000 people working in the industry, the next size of the onion is a few million, right? So you have way more people both involved, but also on the periphery. And I think that changes how we need to communicate. If you're just in the bubble, focus on the bubble. But what we need to do now, and this is a lot of my personal work that you'll be seeing a lot of this year, is we need to reach that next layer of the onion. And so again, this is kind of my mantra for us all, because if we can reach that second layer, it will make everything else easier. It will make policymaking easier. It will make investment easier, right? It just helps with everything else.
It's really cool to hear that Sebastian's approaching his work with this sort of deliberate mindset of expanding the bubble, or as he says it, the onion. In this case, he's not trying to engage climate change skeptics, for example, in the nuances of CDR policy. He's focusing on where knowledge can have the most impact.
I think this is an important reminder that when you're in a bubble, you can't always just move beyond it or pop the bubble. You know, like Galinda in Wicked. She has power over her bubble. Bubbles can be good things. That's where the deep work is done, where experts with different backgrounds and experiences can connect and share their expertise. But at the same time, we should be asking, who needs to know about CDR but doesn't? Who can we bring into this bubble? Or what neighbouring bubbles can we get a little closer to and start working with, forming perhaps a bubble cluster?
Yeah, a big bubble.
A bubble of bubbles.
Yeah, and who's in the next layer of this bubble or onion that can help catalyse this movement?
Yeah, we're like mixing our metaphors all over the place, but I'm here for it. Just let's keep onions out of my bubble bath. That's all I ask. Honestly, the thing that this whole episode has really driven home for me is that we're really still just at the beginning of the CDR journey. We started off the episode by reflecting on the changes that have happened since we started working on this show over 4 years ago. But while these changes have been massive, and our own personal journeys have been pretty major, we're still really ambling through the foothills of the CDR mountain. And as daunting as the climb ahead might be, I think it's pretty exciting.
And I'm particularly excited that we're back on the Carbon Removal Show train and getting some more episodes out to our listeners over the coming weeks.
Choo-choo! Get on board!
Oh dear.
No, very excited to be aboard this train with you, Tom. And you, Ben. Thank goodness we're back. I miss us when we're not around.
Yeah, well, you are our number one fan, Emily, of your own podcast.
Got to back yourself.
But anyways, all of these conversations over the past few months have made clear that there's a big subject that we need to tackle if we're going to keep cracking open the CDR conversation and exploring how to grow this space in the best ways possible. That is policy.
The big one. Or at least one of the big ones. It's a big one. It's big.
It is a big one. And it's just really relevant to everything that we've spoken about. We know we need to grow CDR. We know that we need more people to join the community. And we know that we need broader public awareness and engagement if we're going to get this on the agenda.
You're right. Let's do it then. Deep breath, everyone. We're diving into policy.
Bring your snorkels.
Thick wetsuit. And a sense of adventure.
Until next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Carbon Removal Show.
Please subscribe if you haven't already and follow us. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads. It helps so much.
And if you could do me this one favour, share this podcast with a friend or a colleague who might resonate with this episode.
A huge thank you to all our coalition members, without whom the Carbon Removal Show would not be possible.
B0, Carbon Engineering, Carbon Gap, Carbon Future,
ClimeFi, Ivatama, Klarna, Mashmakes,
Milky Wire, Negative Emissions Platform, Opna,
Patch, Pinwheel, Plan Boo, Recarber,
Sebastian Manhart, Standard Gas Technologies, Supercritical, and Offstream.
If you or your company are interested in joining this amazing coalition, please get in touch.
The Carbon Removal Show is hosted by me, Tom Praviti,
And me, Emily Swaddle.
And produced by me, Ben Weaver Hinks.